Welcome, everybody. Thank you for spending your Thursday night with us. We are very grateful for your interest. Um, I think we could probably go ahead and get started. Um, my name is Elizabeth Warner. I'm the Communication Director for the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and I am so happy to see all of you. Today, we are diving into one of the most important but often overlooked aspects of state government, which is our budget process. Budgets are not just numbers on a spreadsheet, although they are certainly that. Fundamentally, it's a statement of priorities that impacts truly every area of our daily lives, from schools and roads to healthcare and public safety. And understanding how this process works gives us the power to ask better questions, to hold our representatives accountable, and importantly, especially for tonight, to advocate for the policies that matter most to us and to our communities. To guide us through this, we are very fortunate to have Nick Bates with us today. Nick serves as the director for Hunger Network Ohio and is the veteran of many Ohio budget cycles. Their experience in navigating state finance and public policy has given them a wealth of knowledge that I am very delighted to have him share with us tonight. So he is going to talk about the budget and how we can engage in the process. So we will have time for questions at the end, but feel free to put them in the Q&A as we go along, and I will try to answer what I can. So Nick, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. This is I was doing the math earlier, my seventh budget of recent years. So I've been doing, with a heavy focus since 2013 on state budget policy. Um, just a little bit about me for those who don't know my background. My name is Nick Bates. I'm the director of the Hunger Network that works to end hunger by addressing the root causes of poverty through public policy advocacy. Before this role, I served as the outreach director with a broad-based coalition, One Ohio Now, that works specifically on budget and tax policy. And before that, before I went to do my graduate studies at Capitol Law and Trinity Lutheran Seminary, I worked at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. So not necessarily budget specific work there, but obviously budget related advocacy work that we did there. So budgets are very important documents. I think there's a couple different ways we can look at the budget. I like to look at it as a roadmap for our future. It kind of lays out the direction. Politicians and elected public servants can say all day what they care about, but until they're willing to put the dollars and the cents behind their priorities, we have to ask if they're really their priorities. So we're going to just jump straight on in. I'm going to try to provide tonight some background on the budget process and kind of where historically we've been on a lot of things, and then talk about some of the governor's proposals that he introduced earlier this month, and then we'll talk about opportunities for engagement or different policy advocacy things that some of y'all might be concerned about. So kind of the brief timetable. So the state budget is a 2-year document. It has to be passed by June 30th because state fiscal years begin July 1st. If of many years on Facebook, I'll post Happy New Year on July 1st as somebody who's a very big nerd on all of this stuff. So the budget process is well underway already over the past month. And then it will go into effect July 1st and continue on until June 30th of 2027, which is a long time. It seems like a lifetime away to be trying to think about how much money our schools are going to need, our parks are going to need, how much investment we need in clean water that far out. But that's what we're looking at. So you can see the governor introduced his version of the budget on February 3rd. And then that is sent to the House Finance Committee. This is about 32 of our 99 House members are on that committee. So a good chance that many of you have a representative that directly represents you or nearby on that committee. But this year, unlike past years, the House has decided not to do subcommittees. Normally, what they would do is they would take those 32, 34 people and divide them up into groups of 4 or 5 to look at specific sections of the state budget. This year, though, they're going to full committee. So instead of having a subcommittee on public education, they're just sending it all over to the education committee. So you can look at this optimistically and say, great, there's a better chance that my legislator who represents me in the House is going to be on this committee. But it also means that for many of us, instead of saying, here are the 34 people we want to focus on, it now grows that list to basically everybody in the Ohio House is on some committee looking at some part of the budget. The House has also sped up their schedule this year compared to past years. So if you've done budget advocacy in the past, things are moving quicker than they have in the past. So normally they wait till their spring break, which centers around Easter, to have their substitute bill and pass it after that. But this year they're trying to have it done before their spring break. So the legislator always takes a 2 week spring break that centers right around the Easter holiday, 1 week before and 1 week after, and they're trying to have their House vote before they leave for that. We'll see if it happens. It may not. That's the current goal. So this is the time to really be making your voices heard on the House side. But as we know from Schoolhouse Rock, how bill passes the House, it then has to go over to the Senate. So what's going to happen, you see on there the substitute bill in early April coming from the House. They're going to rewrite the entire budget proposal that the governor came out with. Then the Senate is going to do a similar process. So when we enter June, we're going to have a House budget, a Senate budget, and a governor's budget. And then that's going to be sent to a conference committee, 6 people, 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate, 2 Republicans from the House, 2 Republicans from the Senate, and 1 Democrat from each chamber because of the numbers currently in the legislature. So 4 Republicans overall, 2 Democrats will then sit down and try to reconcile the governor's, the House, and the Senate version of the budget to have it passed. So that's kind of the time frame that we're looking at between now and June 30th. Elizabeth, were there any questions in the chat on any of that?
We have a question about how the federal budget is going to impact Medicaid in particular, and I know we're going to come to that. I just wanted to flag it for you
Yep.
here.
Yeah, so whoever asked that question, I don't have the chat box up because it always causes weird clicking. But we come to that. But that's a great, very, very stressful and important question. Um, so why budgets matter? So, Hunger Network, we work with faith communities. So one thing I like to emphasize, whether you're a person of faith or not of faith, we all have kind of a sense of ethics and morality. And budgets are moral documents. They are about our values. So when you talk to neighbors and legislators and friends and community groups about the budget, always lead with your values. I believe as a state, we should be investing in public education because every child deserves access to equitable and adequate schools. That's a value. And we need to make sure that we are emphasizing those values and making sure that we are advocating that those values are represented with the dollars and cents to carry them out. So a lot of people, don't focus too much on a lot of these specific numbers, but it kind of gives you a representation here of what we're talking about. So in the state of Ohio, when we talk about the budget generically, we're often talking about a very specific part of all of our state budgets. So right now, they're already moving the transportation budget. That always moves a little bit quicker. That funds state highway patrol and roads and bridges. Predominantly funded by the gas tax, goes for the transportation budget. That's not included in this. Then our main operating budget, House Bill 96, actually has 2 components to it. There's the GRF, or the General Revenue Fund, and then there's designated funds. So designated funds, you go to a state park, you pay your campground rental fee of $28 a night. That is a designated fund for that state campground, basically, right? So those are kind of separated out. The general revenue funds are what the legislature gets to decide on year in and year out. So as you can see here, education, Medicaid are the primary expenses in the state of Ohio. Now, one of the things I also like to point out is Medicaid seems like it's a big, big chunk. And people say, well, maybe we should invest more in education and less in Medicaid. It doesn't quite work that way because if you look and see that big gray pie chart of the federal revenue, the federal government right now for Medicaid programs reimburses, depending on the program, between about 65% on the dollar up to 90 cents on the dollar. So if we cut Medicaid programs in Ohio, under the status quo, we'll come to talk about some potential changes at the federal level that are being thrown around right now. If we cut state Medicaid programs, we lose that federal match. And as we look at our economy, I met many rural hospitals would not be able to stay open without these Medicaid dollars. So then think about a rural small town community, the hospital closes down, that's a bunch of laid off nurses and doctors and janitorial staff and receptionists. And then that's going to be money that's not going to the local restaurant or the local corner store. And it just goes down the list, right? So then we actually end up with less money if we cut Medicaid because we've just pulled all that money out of the economy. So we can't, it's not a direct trade off with Medicaid to other programs, but this is on how it breaks out. The other thing I'd like to point out is as you look at the income tax and sales tax as our two primary state sources of revenue, it used to be flipped. Before about 20 years ago, we started all the big thing called the tax shift. And before that, the state income tax brought in more revenue than the state sales tax. And the income tax is based on a person's ability to pay. You earn more money, you pay a little bit more. Sales tax, though, is more of what we call a regressive tax. It hits low income and middle income people harder. So as I mentioned, we've had this 20 years of a tax shift. We've cut the state income tax rates 13 times. Most people don't realize we've had 13 income tax cuts in the past 20 years. And remember, that includes the Great Recession. We were cutting taxes when we were saying we don't have enough money to fund our schools and we were closing programs left and right. Tax cuts were still the story of the day. During the pandemic, still was tax cuts. And that while they've cut these state income tax, they've also raised the sales tax and they've cut funding that used to be part of revenue sharing agreements to the local governments. So what is the result of this? Local governments receiving less from the state. They've had to raise property taxes. They offer fewer services, and they also raise their local sales tax. So this is one of the reasons why people feel that we're receiving less services, but we might be paying more because the wealthy are paying a lot less. Those who are in the top like 10% and 5% of income earners are paying thousands of dollars less in taxes, while those in the middle are paying, a little bit more, and those low income folks are actually paying a lot more than they would have been 20 years ago. Any questions?
Nope, I think we're in good shape for right now.
So what does this mean? So if you adjust for inflation, this is what the Ohio budget for higher education has looked like with about $1.5 billion cut between the fiscal year 2000 and fiscal year 2024. K-12 education, obviously in the late 90s, early 2000s, the DeRolf decisions were coming out. We need equitable and adequate education spending by the state. But we've been kind of up and down and really haven't hit that goal as of yet. And when you take out the Medicaid funding and look at all of our other health and human services, all of our anti-poverty programs, you can see that we've cut close to $2 billion during that. And then during the pandemic, you see that little spike there at the end. That's a lot of federal aid coming in from the pandemic to bring us up to about the $3 billion level. So we can see on where these big tax cuts, how we've lost revenue and where it's hit the biggest areas in health and human services, education, higher education, and K-12 education. And then some people always wonder, well, what does that actually mean for Ohioans? And we can see here back in 2000, Ohio had a rate of hunger which is obviously where I spend most of my time looking at, of below 10% and below the national average. But we have been unable to maintain that. Obviously, during the Great Recession, hunger spiked. And in the aftermath, it started to come down. But then, and a lot of the federal relief dollars during COVID continued to hold it steady at a lower rate. But as those started to go away in 2021, 2022, we're seeing hunger spike once again. And these slides should be available to everyone afterwards if you want to stare at the numbers and the lines on the chart a little bit more. So on February 3rd, the governor released his budget. He anticipates about $46 billion a fiscal year for the general revenue fund. So remember, that's about half of our overall general operating budget. And it's a 2-year budget. So you'll see some people saying it's $100 billion a year or about $200 billion budget. Yes, all of that is accurate. Numbers can always be confused, but I think for say a good conversation, it's always nice to just focus on 1 year at a time um, to understand some of these things. So DeWine focused a lot of his budget release when he's been talking about the budget on children and families. And if you've followed Governor DeWine's career for his decades in different elected offices in Ohio, you would know that children and families has been one of his consistent themes that he's always talked about. But during his budget release, I'm very happy I wasn't playing any adult games with beverages because if we pick the word continuing or continued, it would not have been a safe day for me to get behind the wheel of a car because he so much of his budget is focused on just continuing the investments that have already been made and continuing the status quo. Now, on one hand, continuing is better than cuts, right? But he's also continuing state investment without COVID dollars. So the state of Ohio received a lot of funding from the federal government to address a lot of different needs in education, health and human services, development, infrastructure, and all, right down the line because of the pandemic and COVID relief and these things. Those dollars are now have been pulled back. So when he says he's continuing status quo funding, he's actually saying we're going to continue pre-pandemic level funding, which is a cut. So for example, the food banks in Ohio, Greater Cleveland Food Bank, Mid-Ohio Food Collective, these programs collectively are losing about $7 million a year, even though hunger, as we saw, is going up. As people talk about this, the legislators keep trying to tell us it's a tight budget. It's a tight budget. No, it's not. It is a normal budget. Revenue is going up in Ohio. There is more money coming in from income and sales tax in 2025, 2026, 2027 than we had in the previous years, but we're just returning to normal. And we still have a choice on whether or not we want to invest to solve big issues. So some of one of the top programs or policies that the governor proposed was a new child tax credit. Ohio currently doesn't have a child tax credit on the books. So what this would do is it would be 5% of your income up to $1,000. So if you make between $2,500 and $20,000, you will receive 5% of your income. Okay. Once you hit that $20,000 mark and 5%, would get you up to that $1,000. Once you get to that point, then it's $1,000 up till about 60,000. And then if you're married, not married, and those sorts of things will come into effect, but then it will begin to phase down. And once you get to about $96,000 of income, you will no longer get the tax credit. And this child tax credit is specifically for children 6 years and younger. The reason why the governor is focusing in on that is because of the high cost of childcare and a lot of the costs associated with having young children. So that you only get the tax credit for the first third of the years of parenting, but this still adds up to about $440 million a year. So would it be great if it were bigger from my perspective? Sure. Would it be great if it expanded to more people? Absolutely. But this is still a very solid proposal um, that he has laid out. I testified on this on the other day at the state in front of Ways and Means Committee. So we'll see what the legislature decides to do with this proposal moving forward. He's also proposed kind of continuing and building on some initiatives around childcare. So he wants to create this childcare voucher program up to 200% of the federal poverty line. Um, so compared to just expanding eligibility for publicly funded childcare, doing it by a voucher, as the director has said, will allow the government to shut off the faucet. So if they reach a certain amount of people applying, they can shut it off and not fund future ones. So if this ends up going to affect, apply early to get your voucher for this. But then we look on he also does still want to increase publicly funded childcare from 145% of the federal poverty line up to 160%. So this, when you just expand a service like this, it says whatever the need is, and you got to kind of guess budgetarily in the beginning, saying what is the need going to be, so we budget the right amount of money. But if you become eligible, you apply. It's not an issue of, uh-oh, I didn't become eligible until October and all the vouchers disappeared in September. On education, the governor has claimed that he is going to continue the phase in the fair school funding plan. So we've had this fair school funding plan that was passed by the General Assembly, had a lot of bipartisan support. For those who have been around, may remember it as the Cup-Patterson Education Funding Plan. Fair school funding plan is its official name. However, and he did this in the last General Assembly too, where he did not update the inputs. So he looked at the cost and the assessments of where we were a few years ago. Now, as we know, there's been a lot of inflation over the past few years. There's been a lot of property reassessments and increases, and that's actually one of the big issues here, because over the past 3 years, Ohioans' property has been valued at a much, much greater level. And the way the formula works, it says we want to first figure out how much can local communities afford to pay with through local property taxes and local income taxes. And then what will the state come in to make up for that? So when you include higher property values from 2025, but then are only using the 2022, 2021 inputs, it creates this broken system where about half of the school districts are going to be flat funded or cut, which is not the intent of this funding formula. So we see about $103 million being cut from public education over the next 2 years, and more than half of the public districts are losing funding. So that has to be addressed. And my next slide will go a little bit into the property tax issue. The state also has 5 voucher programs, and collectively they will see a 16.5% funding increase over the next 2 years. So as we can see, there's this direct trade-off right now of we're increasing voucher spending while cutting investments in our public education system, even though the vast, vast majority of students are in our public schools and not in private and charter schools. On the higher education front, we saw the governor propose an idea to link job placement after graduation to school funding. So there are a lot of concerns about this. For example, if you have a lot of social work students or who have then lower incomes their first few years out of college, will that penalize the school? Oh, you're not doing enough to create high wage earners. Or if you have a lot of folks who are in programs that set them up for graduate school, oh, well, you don't have people working, they're still in school. Well, obviously. So there's some very confusing things. Plus, you have folks, a few years after graduation from my undergrad, I went and was a stay-at-home dad for a couple of years. Would that have penalized my alma mater? So there's some concerns about this. We did see an increase in the Ohio College Opportunity Grant, which is a good need-based scholarship to help out low and middle income families trying to afford education. So I do want to take a moment just because one of the big things that I think could likely happen in this budget is they're going to add in a massive amount of property tax reform. Right, last General Assembly, property taxes obviously are a big issue in our local communities. I know folks within local League of Women voter groups across the state have often held community forums whenever local levies are on the ballot. So this is probably a review for many of you all. But in Ohio, we don't just do a tax rate, we base it on mills, which is we take the valuation and we only take 35% of the valuation. So 1 mil basically equals $35 of tax that you have to pay. Now in Ohio, there can be up to 10 mils of valuation, and that will rise automatically as your property taxes get reassessed. So if your house went from being valued at 100,000 up to 200,000, that 10 mils will go up. One of the big things, though, is the property tax money never comes to the state. So when the state, well, it comes to the state, but it's distributed back. It's not part of our general operating budget. So when the state says, hey, we're going to reduce property taxes, it's easy to cut somebody else's budget, right? They're cutting then the budgets for our schools, for senior services, children's services, roads, public safety, parks, and all of that. So what we have to be very careful of is if they do things to the property tax situation in Ohio, which there do need to be reforms there, are they going to make sure that the districts stay whole? And the state back in 2005 did a massive property tax shift around businesses and inventory on store shelves. And they had made a promise to keep the local communities whole. And then they walked that back about 10 years later. Also, one of the important things to remember is even when our property taxes do go up, we have to remember that it's not always economic boom for our local school districts, which is a weird thing to think about. So because of House Bill 920 in 1978, what ended up happening is if you vote in a 5 mil levy, it's going to generate $3 million. And then all of our property taxes in the county go up. That 5 mil levy might come down to 4 or 3 mil levy for the calculation. So it still generates 35 or the $3 million, but they're not necessarily getting it. So sometimes some people's rates go up, some people's go down based on that. So, and one of the confusing things is right now, so the inside millage can be up to 10 mils. And then we have replacement levies, which will replace the same mills on your updated value. So if you vote for a 5 mil replacement levy, they will then say you get 5 mils like you did before on your new $200,000 home instead of your $100,000 home. But a renewal will renew what you currently pay. So local governments have been struggling with this in this language. But this is one of the issues where there isn't necessarily a huge economic windfall for our school districts right now, even though our property taxes for many of us have gone up in the past few years. It's a weird thing. It highlights, I think, part of the problems where we do need to simplify this process, make it more easy to understand. But we have to be careful not to negatively impact the schools and community services that are being funded through property taxes. Because it's easy to cut someone else's budget when you don't have to make the tough choices on who gets fired or what services are cut afterwards. The governor did propose 3 big tax changes in his budget. The tobacco tax, he wants to double it, and also create equalization of other tobacco products. And he would use some of this funding to help offset the cost of that child tax credit that was proposed earlier. He also wants to double the marijuana taxes and designate that for specific programs, many of which are already designated for in the law that voters approved at the ballot. And he also wants to double the tax on sports gaming. I do not understand what a parlay is. Other people do, but I guess that's a thing. And so if you double the tax there, he would put that funding into a thing to help fund sports stadiums and also youth sports. But realistically, I really don't think my Parks and Rec soccer team is going to be able to compete against the Haslam brothers for funding to build a new stadium. So as I said, we were going to come to Medicaid. So Medicaid right now, and it's always important to remember the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is a federally funded program and administered by the federal government. Medicaid funding comes to the state and is administered at the state level. So it's one of these things right now at the federal government, we're hearing them say, we're not going to cut any direct assistance program, but Medicaid might not be one of those direct assistance programs, right? And we did see in the budget framework passed at the federal level where they have opened up the possibility for hundreds of billions of dollars of cuts to Medicaid. Medicaid right now is a major, major program in the state, covering about half of all births in the state, and covering many, not just low, but many middle income earners as well. Um, there has been a proposal in the budget to that if the feds cut funding for Medicaid programs in Ohio, then the state will have to get rid of Medicaid expansion. I think the intent of that language was if the feds cut Medicaid expansion funding, that 90% reimbursement, then we will have to look at how we restructure this. But I think the language is also right now very dangerous that if they cut $5, it actually sets us up to cut over 770,000 people off of health insurance like that. One of the other things as we're looking at the intersection of the federal budget debates and the state is there's been talk about block grants, taking SNAP and Medicaid and creating a block grant. So what they would do is say, all right, Ohio, here's $20 billion of a Medicaid block grant. Do with it what you want. Now, that might sound good. Oh, less bureaucracy and all that. But what we saw what happened back in the 90s, they block granted what used to be cash assistance for low income folks. You know, if you were struggling to make ends meet, here's your check. That barely exists anymore in Ohio. So then what we do now is that money is now what we call the TANF block grant, and that is funding our food banks and childcare. But if they send us $20 billion in a Medicaid block grant, that's going to be 20 billion this year, 20 billion next year. 10 years from now, we'll still only be getting $20 billion. And, you know, I don't know if people have heard, but there's this thing called inflation that exists in the world. So with that inflation, it puts us into a situation where those dollars just aren't going to go as far. And it is a slow way to cut programs dramatically. And we're seeing that right now with a lot of our anti-poverty efforts that they threw all under TANF. And TANF barely funds what it was originally intended for, that direct cash assistance for folks. Um, so on housing, there was no increase to the Ohio Housing Trust Fund, which is one of our state's main sources of there for funding around affordable housing programs and homeless services. There was a proposal to use some of the sales tax holiday fund to help support some local government efforts to develop housing in border counties and rural areas, specifically focused there. They would not spend $100 million, but that's only one-time funding. H2 Ohio and environmental issues, a lot of status quo efforts there. And the governor did propose an increase to the rate of the local government fund and the public library fund. These are not being restored because under the Kasich administration, these were each cut in half. So while slight increases are great, they don't get us back to where we used to be and the funding that our local communities need from the state. I think, yeah. Any questions on any of those things at this point in time?
A little bit. So Michael asked, there's been a history of slipping totally unrelated provisions without testimony or debate into budget legislation. Is that legal? Has that ever been tested in court? And I just want to give like a little bit of context to that question in this moment. So the House has been working on the transportation budget. So, you know, roads, bridges, that sort of thing. At one point, some folks in the committee put amendments in that had to do with voting. So, we are paying attention extra now. And those provisions um, truly had nothing to do with transportation. And happily, they were taken out in this instance. So, yay. Um, but I expect we're going to see that probably a few more times before this is over in June. Um, it is when the lawmakers are working on the budget, is this legislation really just sort of the same as any other legislation that lawmakers are kind of having their Christmas tree moments and they're just sticking in whatever is fitting with their own agenda? Or is there anything sacred about the budget?
So there are a few different rules in the budget process and in the budget bill as it has to be passed in a lot of other legislation. For example, it has to begin in the House Finance Committee compared to bills can begin normally in any committee or House or Senate. Um, and also the budget bill, the governor has the ability to line item veto provisions in budget bills. So that's something also a little unique about the budget compared to a lot of other legislation. So in that respect, those are kind of the big things that I would be focused on. But yeah, I mean, in general, from the Christmas tree mindset, yes, they can come in and hang all their little ornaments on. And when we look at the single subject issue rule, because in Ohio, every bill can only be about one issue. But with a budget bill, does the budget funds the Office of Secretary of State? So saying, here are the rules we want the Secretary of State to follow on these things, or the county Board of Elections, or it opens it up. And while I wish we could get courts to be more stringent on enforcing the single subject rule, I don't anticipate that happening, especially with a budget bill.
That seems unlikely. So you took us through the steps of the budget. So, the governor's role is first and last. So he gives the proposal to the legislature. First the House takes it, um, rewrites it to what they think is best. Then it goes to the Senate, and then reconciliation, and then it goes to the governor. So what are the opportunities for us as citizens to advocate? Are there times when it's better? Are there times when it's worse? What's sort of the optimum strategy from an advocacy point of view?
So, when we look at the timeline, right now it's in the House, so focusing on those House members, but the Senate's going to have it very, very soon as well. So contacting your state senators. Sadly, I often hear from senators, well, we'll deal with it when we get to it. And then as soon as they get the budget, like, oh, sorry, we're all booked up for time. But yeah, so I think right now, one of the biggest things is, especially as we think about neighborhood and community needs, is helping our legislators to see specifically what's going on. I was just talking to some folks earlier today about getting their legislators out to some transitional housing programs that they've run up in northeastern Ohio, and helping them think through kind of who to invite and how to go about that process because they need to see it. We have seen. I was up with the Ohio Association of Food Banks a couple weeks ago for their lobby day, and there was an article afterwards, and sadly, we saw quotes from leading House legislators on the budget saying that basically they didn't think that hunger was a big issue right now in Ohio. You don't get 250 people out at the State House for an advocacy day if it's not a big issue. Um, so it was, just helping them to realize the needs that exist, I think is a major, major thing that can have that will be very beneficial. So obviously, House members now and Senate members in a few weeks or in about a month or so, really zero in on your senators, but then also get those letters into the governor because if things are added in, or especially around some of the you know the unrelated budget language and things, he can go in there with his pen and cross it out. And we have seen the governor, he doesn't do it often. But when they passed, what was it, House Bill 68 back in the last General Assembly, he did veto it. That was the ban on trans youth gender affirming health care. He did veto that bill because as in his words was he talked to families and caregivers and realized that this you can't take a sledgehammer to issues that are very nuanced and delicate. Um, so especially once this bill gets passed through the House and Senate, I could see him willing to veto some things that are extra harmful.
So the best periods are kind of right now while the House is debating, and then when it gets to the Senate and they're debating, once both chambers have passed the budgets that they have decided on, and it goes into conference committee, there are not opportunities at that point for testimony or advocacy. So we should really plan to get all of our emails and our testimony and our phone calls in before it gets to conference committee. Is that right?
As much as you can. Yeah, I would say though that even after it hits, it's down to technically those six individuals, and we understand how partisanship works. Those four individuals on that conference committee, but it's also going to be leadership, and there are many. There are individuals who aren't going to necessarily be in that conference committee, who are leaders, well respected within their party, on budgetary issues that we can continue to push and advocate for. But really, at that point, it's got to be like laser focused. Senator Smith, please take out these three lines that you all are looking at.
And so then the next opportunity, and it sounds like maybe kind of throughout the process, pressuring, maybe that's not a nice word, expressing our thoughts to the governor is the other avenue where
Mhm.
there could be some change that happens. Okay.
Yep.
Jill had a question. With the decrease in funding for education, but increase for for vouchers for schools, what is going to be the impact overall on Ohio's education system? Oh, Jill, that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, and when you look at, over half the school districts receiving cuts, and this is one of the things, even with our, gerrymandering that we have to deal with in Ohio, all 99 House members and all 33 state senators have multiple school boards in their district. And a lot of times those school board members are of the same political party as their representative. And they, eat dinner at the local diner every, Thursday night. And so there are relationships. And when you have so many people in local communities, my gut is they're going to change around how the education funding is looking. If it gets better or worse, I can't say right now. Um, but it's sort of the best way to describe what the governor did is he punted on the issue of school funding. I think if what he proposed stays in effect, we're going to see a lot of teachers losing their jobs, extra fees for sports and activities, fewer of those clubs and things. And one of the problems, and we saw this with the local government funding when Governor Kasich was scaling back a lot of those revenue sharing programs, is it didn't hit all at the same time. One district might be able to keep things going as they are right now, while another one has to cut 5 teachers next week. So then that district is in crisis. But then in a year from now, when District A is having to deal with their cuts, District B has already moved on and they're not thinking about how their cuts a year ago are connected to District A's cuts now. So I think it's up for us as community advocates and leaders is really to help draw these connections for folks across individual district lines. If these cuts go into effect, to help draw the connection and point back to the cause of them, of states, of the state legislative leaders' refusal to properly fund our schools.
Yeah, we at the league just came out with a report written by our wonderful education specialist, Susie Kaiser, who illustrates very clearly that, overwhelmingly Ohio students are getting their education from public education, and that many counties don't even have, or areas don't even have options for charter schools. And so it was $1 billion in school vouchers that were funded last year. Um, that money is really going to just six or seven counties, the counties that have sort of the dense population. And so, an argument that I think we're going to start seeing a lot more when we're talking with legislators is for rural communities, vouchers are a disaster. And so, I think that's something that we, are going to are keep talking about, and putting the link to that report in our chat here. Um, Ohio has a particularly um, bonkers, maybe elegant way of funding our schools. Are there states that have done this well?
Yes, I feel there are states that have done it much better than us. And I think the main thing to look at is um, whose responsibility is it to fund public education? Is it the individual parents? Well, no, because I have two kids. Yes, I want my kids to have a good life and be educated, cared for, and that's my responsibility as a father. But as a society, as a community, we all want my kids to have a good education so that they can be responsible citizens and engaged and thinkers that can help lead our community in the future, right? We all benefit from the public education that our doctor receives. Um, so I think we have to recognize that in Ohio's constitution, it says it is not even the local city's responsibility to educate the kids. The Constitution says it is the state of Ohio's responsibility. So if that's the case, then we have to make sure that as a state, we are doing this equitably and fairly. I mean, I've heard people float, I mean, it's one of these things where do we continue to try to build on the current system and tweak the current system to make it better? Or do we say, you know what? No more local property taxes. We're going to have one state property. I mean, this is a wild idea. Do not assume I am proposing this, although I might be. Have a statewide property tax where all the money is collected at the state level, then redistributed to the schools in a more equitable fashion. Like that is an option that we could be looking at. I think there would be a lot of concern and questions about any kind of big change. Um, but I think that the reality is, if we want to be the best place to raise a child, which is what the governor says his goal is, we need to get very serious about properly funding our schools so that kids aren't having to deal with ceiling tiles falling in on them. And every school has access to social workers and reading specialists and guidance counselors and all these other things that we know are essential for education.
So when the governor's budget first came out, we really praised that he had made that commitment to fully funding the last phase of the fair funding um, plan. Do you, and I like that you said punted. I appreciate that word here. Do you think that that was a deliberate choice to sort of ignore inflation, or was that an oversight? And I guess I know we can't be in the minds of other people, but
So, if I had to guess, as the governor is looking at this and knowing that he's a lame duck legislator and knowing, kind of the partisan politics that exist within the Republican Party right now, um, and just trying to figure out how he navigates those as kind of one of these very traditional Republicans, and then you got all this new, batch of Party electorate going on, and he's been trying to be savvy in how he navigates that. Um, what I feel he did is knowing that all these legislators have local school boards, knowing that 2 years ago, all those local school boards and teachers voiced their concerns to legislators, and they then made the increase. then they are going to be more likely and comfortable in owning government spending if it comes from them. So, and I think this is very much his demeanor, just as somebody who's, watched him over the past 20 or so years in public life. He very much wants, I think he wants the legislator to make this decision. And I think he hopes they do. But yes, I think that was kind of, he was trying to be a little strategic and getting them to do it so that they have ownership of it and aren't fighting him.
So going back to the advocacy, I think we know when we are, in persuasion mode that the best way to kind of connect is to tell the stories that are humanizing and that you can um, help that other person have some empathy and imagine scenarios outside of maybe what they walked in the room knowing.
Mhm.
What has your experience been kind of a best practice for messaging our lawmakers when it comes to the budget? Are there things that kind of phrases or orientations that you have found to be successful when you are advocating on behalf of the issues that you are passionate about?
Yeah, so the first thing I encourage everyone to do is before you walk into a meeting with a legislator, pick up the phone to call them, read a little bit of, on their website, read their bio, see what they care about. I often like to say, our values, their language. Um, because here's the thing, it doesn't matter if someone's a Democrat or Republican. I want Ohio to be the best place to raise a child. I want Ohio to have, great parks and safe and healthy communities. Um, those aren't partisan things. So I think figuring out what it is they care about, um, and then framing our things in that language. So some legislators, I think often we end up stuck in numbers and data, and I think that's important after the story,
Yeah,
because we have to have that emotional buy-in
right.
first for them to care. Because if we go in with a lot of data and numbers, it seems like it's a partisan hit, And so many of these legislators, we have to remember where they're coming from. As soon as they get elected, they have to start fundraising for their next election campaign. Wish it wasn't that way, but let's deal with the world we have right now. So they're also, if we had fair districts, they
Oh,
would be most concerned about appeasing their constituents. But because of gerrymandering, they have to make sure they're raising money to be able to access and get the right endorsements that appeal to that small section of their primary party voters. So that means they have to be in good with leadership and other key leaders. So I think the more that we can pull them away from this Capitol Square area, either physically or with a story, hey, I saw that you graduated from, North Olmsted High School. That's great. I graduated from there too. Were you there when the high school burned down back in the 90s?
right.
We need to make sure that we
I'm
have
a
good
person,
discussions with
you're a
those folks.
person, we are people
Yep.
together. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think finding those kind of connections can really go a long way because with the gerrymandering, it is created such a wall between elected officials and the actual communities they're supposed to be representing.
Accountability. Yeah, 100.
Um, so obviously, preaching to the choir on this issue with legal
We have
info.
big thoughts on this one. Yes, I think we have a little experience in this department. It's true.
um,
Um, I
but
have,
yeah, that's why I also encourage folks to invite your legislators out. So if you have a local food pantry or, come in, donuts with dad's day at your local
yeah,
elementary school, invite the legislators to come to those things to realize, oh, we're not talking about a line item. We're not talking about some political issue. We're talking about people.
yeah, that's great advice. I have one more question, but before I get to that, we are wrapping up. Do folks have any other questions that they want to ask Nick before we bid adieu for the evening? I'll give people a second to type if there's any questions.
And I'll say that the list on the screen here is far from a complete list. I just copied and pasted from one organization that was starting to compile some of these advocacy days. There are lots and lots of groups that are going to be setting up events at the State House in the next 2 months. 2, 3 months. Go to your favorite organization, come on down. Um, if you have a group that you'd like to set up an advocacy day in Columbus, you have no idea how to do it, reach out to me. I'd be happy to give you some pointers.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, my last question. Once it's all done, Governor DeWine has signed the budget on, the last day, presumably of June. Um, how can we, as citizens, kind of track how spending is happening? How much transparency is there in funding allocation that we are actually able to see?
Yeah, so the state does have an online checkbook that tracks individual spending. So if there's specific things, you can go in there. I've gone in there and played around with it a few times, just to see if it actually works. And I have family members who are teachers, and it's like, oh, look, I can see exactly how much my family members are making. Wow, they don't make a lot. But yeah, so for kind of that transparency thing, individual programs all have their audits that occur. Um, and I would say if there's specific programs and things, the legislative committees continue to work on these things. A lot of times there will be study committees or further conversation. So if K-12 school funding is your passion, you really want to understand all that, follow the House and Senate education committees and see, kind of the bills and how they're evaluating things moving on. You are able, if you email the chair of the committee, just click on their thing, see what district they're from, rep or, their emails are all pretty the same. And you can get added to a committee email list where they'll email you each week if the committee's having a meeting, what bills they are looking at. And they will have from time to time people from the administration come in to provide reports about different programs and initiatives.
Stephanie asked if you could share a link to that tracker, and if not right this second, but later, and then I will send it out to everybody when I'm
Yeah.
sharing a follow-up. Um, I think it would be super interesting to kind of play around with it. And, the takeaway, kind of a common theme throughout all of this is we got to pay attention to what's happening. And that, I
Mhm.
think it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Talking of adult beverage games, my the other day was if I had to do a shot for every time I said, with everything that's going on, I would be in my cups by like mid-morning. Um, and so, we're all sort of like processing a lot, trying to absorb as much as we can. We have to pick a few things we care about and really lean into that stuff and watch what our legislators are doing, watch what um, our state house is doing, and the further away we are from the decision makers, the less kind of influence and leverage we have. So many of us, I'm sure, have big feelings about what's happening in Washington. We should absolutely be advocating there, but we have more opportunities for influencing our lawmakers here. And that's even more true for, your city council, your school board. Um, so just a plug to keep seeing what's happening, to plug into the resources that exist. Local media is a blessing. Lots of organizations, your organization, our organization, many organizations are really doing a lot and on top of it. So find an organization that you believe in and follow them. Individuals don't have to invent a wheel. There are lots of smart people out there doing this. So find the smart people and kind of hitch your wagon to them because together your voice is really powerful.
Yeah. And just my closing thoughts to kind of piggyback off of that, we are all the experts of our own stories. And right now, there are so many new legislators who have to be experts on how millage works inside mills, outside mills, have to be experts on TANF grants and Medicaid funding and, how to, road funding and different types of asphalt. They have to become experts in all of it. They can't be experts in your story unless you tell them. And your story can represent that of thousands, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Nick. This has been super helpful. Folks, I will send out slides in the recording and some of the links that we talked about later. Thank you again. Be well, everybody. Good night. Thank you. Bye.